When the Second World War began, the Luftwaffe entered the conflict with a reputation built on speed, precision, and disciplined training. From 1939 to 1941, German fighter units dominated nearly every front they touched. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109E, sleek, sharp-nosed, and deadly in a climb, became the symbol of a new kind of air superiority. In Poland, in France, and over the Low Countries, the Jagdwaffe imposed a fast, aggressive style of air combat few opponents could match. Even after the Battle of Britain, where the Luftwaffe first tasted a serious strategic setback, German pilots did not lose confidence in their machines. Many veterans believed the Bf-109F and later the G-series were still among the best single-engine fighters in the world. The aircraft's tight turning radius, high-altitude performance, and excellent rate of climb reinforced the idea that German engineering and German pilots still held the advantage in one-on-one fighting. By late 1942, as the United States began daylight bombing over Europe, the Luftwaffe faced a new enemy. Large, disciplined formations of B-17s and B-24s flying at altitudes where German fighters felt most comfortable. The early American escort fighters, however, did not inspire fear. The P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful but short-legged. The P-38 Lightning struggled in extreme cold at high altitude. German units quickly learned that American fighters would accompany the bombers only to the edge of Germany, then turn for home. Once the escorts peeled away, the bomber streams were vulnerable, and German pilots knew it. The attacks on Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943, followed by the catastrophic Black Thursday raid on 14 October, reinforced German confidence. Bombers fell in frightening numbers. Luftwaffe units returned to base battered but triumphant, convinced the Americans could not sustain such losses. Many pilots believed the strategic bombing campaign would eventually stall, and that no Allied fighter had the range or the performance to challenge them deep inside the Reich. From cockpit to command headquarters, one belief held strong: German fighters ruled the interior skies of Europe. But far away from the front lines, a new design was quietly evolving, one that would soon force the Luftwaffe to question every assumption it had built the air war upon. The aircraft that would one day shatter German confidence did not begin its life as a feared interceptor. In fact, the Mustang entered the war largely unnoticed. In 1940, when the British Purchasing Commission requested more Curtiss P-40s, North American Aviation instead proposed building an entirely new fighter from scratch. The result, the NA-73X prototype, was completed in a remarkably short time. It was sleek, aerodynamically clean, and impressively fast at low altitudes. But there was a problem. Its Allison engine simply could not breathe at high altitude. The early P-51 and A-36 variants performed well in low-level reconnaissance and ground attack roles, but above 15,000 feet they struggled. They were not considered suitable bomber escorts, nor serious rivals for the Bf-109 or FW-190 in the cold, thin air where strategic air battles were actually fought. To German intelligence officers, these early Mustangs were nothing remarkable, certainly nothing to fear. Then came the British experiment that changed everything. Rolls-Royce engineers installed their Merlin 61 engine into the Mustang's airframe, creating a hybrid with extraordinary potential. High-altitude performance soared. Climb rate and top-end speed jumped dramatically. Suddenly, the Mustang could fight where the bombers flew, and fight well. The Americans quickly adopted the concept, leading to the XP-51B, and soon after, the mass-produced P-51B/C. These new variants arrived in Europe in late 1943, carrying something even more important than speed: range. With internal fuel, a rear fuselage tank, and a pair of drop tanks under the wings, the Mustang could escort bombers farther than any single-engine Allied fighter ever had. Still, German pilots remained skeptical. Reports of a new American fighter with remarkable climb performance reached Luftwaffe staff rooms, but many dismissed the information as exaggeration. To them, Allied fighters always turned back. No matter the type, Spitfire, Thunderbolt, Lightning, they all lacked the legs to follow the bombers deep into German airspace. And early encounters with P-51s were sporadic. Many Luftwaffe pilots assumed these were just modified P-40s or lightly built reconnaissance types. Some even joked about the strange moose silhouette with its long nose and high tail. But jokes, like assumptions, do not last long in war, because soon the Mustangs would be given a new mission, one designed to break the Luftwaffe entirely. For years, German pilots relied on a predictable pattern. American fighters would appear near the border, circle the bomber formations for a brief time, and then, almost on schedule, turn back toward England. Once they left, the Luftwaffe struck with full force. That rhythm shaped every tactic the Germans used. The Mustang shattered that rhythm. The first major shock came when P-51s were spotted over central Germany, still tied closely to the bomber columns. Pilots of Jagdgeschwader 1 and 11 radioed reports of single-engine escorts still present, long after the point where P-47s and P-38s were expected to vanish. Moments later, Mustangs were intercepted near targets like Gotha and Oschersleben, locations so deep that many German pilots assumed the bombs must already be falling. The realization spread quickly. The Americans finally had a fighter that could follow them everywhere. The second angle was more personal and far more frightening. Experienced Luftwaffe aces knew escape tactics that had saved them dozens of times. A steep dive into thicker air, a zoom climb back into the clouds, or a sharp brake turn using the Bf-109's tight radius. These maneuvers had frustrated Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings for years. But against the P-51B and later the P-51D, many of those old habits failed. The Mustang's top speed, over 430 miles per hour at altitude, matched or surpassed most late-war German fighters. Its laminar flow wing maintained energy astonishingly well in both climbs and dives. German pilots reported Mustangs clinging behind them even as they pushed their Messerschmitts past safe speed limits. Some attempted dives that once guaranteed escape, only to watch the Mustang grow larger in the mirror. This was not just a technical surprise, it was a psychological one. The third angle came from something as simple as a pilot's field of vision. The Bf-109's narrow cockpit, reinforced frames, and limited rear visibility had always been a disadvantage. In contrast, the P-51D introduced a full bubble canopy, giving American pilots a nearly unobstructed 360-degree view. Combined with improved radios and tactics centered on fluid, roaming fighter groups, the Mustangs arrived in battle with better situational awareness and more coordinated movement. German pilots saw only glimpses of these advantages at first, but soon they would feel all of them at once, when the Mustangs stopped merely escorting bombers and began actively hunting the Jagdwaffe. In January 1944, Major General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force and issued an order that transformed the air war. Fighter escorts were no longer required to stay glued to the bomber formations. For years, American fighters had been tied to strict protective screens around the B-17s and B-24s. They defended, but they did not pursue. They reacted, but they did not range freely. Doolittle ended that doctrine. Now Mustangs, light, fast, and hungry, were unleashed ahead of the bomber streams. Their mission was simple: attack the Luftwaffe wherever it formed, flew, or tried to hide. German pilots soon encountered P-51s not at the bombers, but waiting for them, orbiting at higher altitude, sweeping the skies, or diving into newly formed German interception groups before they could organize. The hunter-killer strategy stunned the Luftwaffe. Many formations were broken apart before they even reached their intended altitude. It was the moment when German pilots began whispering a hard truth. The Americans were taking the offensive in the fighter war. January 1944, 30,000 feet above central Germany, thin winter sunlight cuts through a sky filled with contrails. A swarm of Bf-109Gs levels out after climbing toward another American bomber stream. The radios crackle with familiar confidence. Someone laughs as he spots small specks far below. Just more new American fighters with tanks hanging under their wings. But the laughter fades. Those specks begin to rise, fast. Faster than expected. Faster than anything the Germans believed a single-engine Allied fighter could climb. And in seconds, the hunters realized the truth. The Mustangs are coming. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's veteran corps had been bled thin. Experienced aces were gone, killed, wounded, or exhausted after years of flying without rest. In their place stood younger pilots with minimal training, often rushed into combat with only a handful of hours in the cockpit. And these young men faced the most capable Allied fighter of the war. Reports describe German pilots spotting Mustangs at altitude and feeling immediate dread. The old confidence, so strong in 1940, so unshakable in 1943, was fading fast. Every scramble felt like a gamble with impossible odds. Every mission ended with fewer aircraft returning. The skies over Germany were no longer a battleground. They were becoming a place of survival. February 20th, 1944. The Allied plan was simple in phrasing, but monumental in scale. Crush the German aircraft industry in a single sustained assault. The operation was codenamed Big Week, and behind it stood thousands of airmen, hundreds of bombers, and, crucially, the new long-range P-51 Mustang. For the Luftwaffe, Big Week began like many previous raids. Radar stations detected incoming streams, and fighter groups scrambled from airfields scattered across the Reich. Pilots expected the usual pattern: fight their way through the escorts, then tear into the heavy bombers. The German leadership believed they could still inflict prohibitive losses. But as the Bf-109s and Fw-190s climbed toward the bomber corridors over Leipzig, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt, something felt different. They were being intercepted too early. American Mustangs were not tied to the bombers. They were not waiting passively at the edges of the stream. They were sweeping ahead, diving down from higher altitude, slashing through German formations before they could organize. P-51 groups hit the Jagdgeschwader during its most vulnerable moments, when aircraft were strung out in climb, still forming up, or turning toward assembly points. Many German pilots later described the same shocking moment: a sudden flash of silver wings, the howl of a Merlin engine, and tracers streaking across their canopy before they even spotted the incoming threat. On February 21st, near Oschersleben, P-51s ripped apart a large Fw-190 formation that was still climbing. The German pilots attempted to dive away, relying on tactics that had worked against P-47s and P-38s. But the Mustangs stayed with them, matching the dive, holding position, then closing the distance. Aircraft that once escaped now fell in flames. The bombers, for the first time in months, reached their targets with significantly reduced losses. By midweek, the pattern was clear. Wherever the Luftwaffe appeared, Mustangs rose to meet them, faster, higher, more aggressive, and in greater numbers. German command realized that something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer facing an escort force. They were facing a fighter offensive aimed directly at the Jagdwaffe itself. Big Week did not end the Luftwaffe, but it bent it sharply, and the break was coming. March 1944 delivered the moment that shattered whatever confidence the Luftwaffe still possessed. For the first time in the war, American bombers, escorted the entire way, reached the heart of the Reich, Berlin, the city that symbolized German power, German prestige, and German invulnerability. Now saw formations of B-17s and B-24s cutting across its airspace like migrating steel clouds. And soaring around them, in loose, predatory arcs, were the P-51 Mustangs. German radar stations reported them early, single-engine fighters at extreme range. But the information seemed impossible. Berlin was too far. No Allied fighter could escort a bomber force that deep, not even the vaunted P-47 or P-38. Many pilots preparing to scramble assumed the reports were errors. They were not. As Jagdgeschwader units climbed from airfields around Wittenberg, Jüterbog, and Verneuken, they found Mustangs already circling above them. The Americans had arrived first. Some German pilots had not even retracted their landing gear before seeing silver flashes dive into their formations. Aces like Johannes Steinhoff and Günter Röhl later described the shock. The Mustang was everywhere, high above, behind, cutting across their turns, appearing in pairs or entire squadrons. Every German maneuver seemed anticipated. Every attempt to disengage met a tight-turning, energy-rich P-51 locking on. It was during this period that Hermann Göring reportedly made his famous admission, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." These were not just escort missions anymore. By spring 1944, the Mustang groups carried out a new form of warfare, deep penetration roving sweeps. After ensuring bomber safety, P-51s were directed to strike secondary targets, airfields, rail hubs, anything that moved. Returning Mustangs often skimmed low over German bases, destroying aircraft during takeoff, landing, or even while parked. One typical mission from late 1944 illustrates the new reality. P-51s escorted bombers over Germany, broke off, attacked 2 Luftwaffe airfields, strafed a train, and still returned to England with fuel to spare. For German pilots, the sky had become hostile in every direction. High altitude, low altitude, approach corridors, even their own runways, all threatened by the Mustang's reach. The laughter that once met early reports of this new American fighter had long disappeared. Now, every German scramble began with a searching glance upward, wondering if the silver shapes were already waiting. The turning point was complete. What remained was the collapse that followed. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter arm was no longer the force that had swept across Europe in the early years of the war. The collapse was not sudden, but steady, a grinding erosion of pilots, aircraft, fuel, and morale. And the P-51 Mustang played a decisive role in that erosion every single day. Experienced German aces, the veterans who had survived the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, and the defense of the Reich, were being lost at a rate the training system could not replace. Younger pilots entered combat with a fraction of the hours once considered essential. Many had never fired their guns in proper practice before facing seasoned American aviators with hundreds of flight hours, and the world's most effective long-range escort fighter at their side. Fuel shortages made training even worse. German airfields often rationed flight time to minutes per student. Some new pilots were told to avoid takeoff unless a scramble alarm sounded. The Mustang's relentless presence turned these weaknesses into fatal vulnerabilities. Every interception, every attempted climb into bomber altitude, carried the risk of being bounced by P-51s arriving from above or behind. The Luftwaffe's bomber interceptor units suffered catastrophic losses as well. The Sturmgruppen, once the pride of Reich Defense, were mauled repeatedly by sweeping Mustang formations. Many units were reduced to half strength in a single week. Others ceased to exist altogether, their remaining aircraft scattered or destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks that had become a daily terror. By the end of 1944, German fighter sortie rates plummeted. Airfields were unsafe, replacement aircraft sat without fuel, and those who did take off often faced overwhelming odds. By this stage of the war, Allied fighters outnumbered German interceptors many times over. The sky above Germany, once a place of confident dominance, had become a realm of constant danger. And the final consequences of that collapse would shape the months that followed. As 1945 approached, the air war over Europe no longer resembled the brutal contests of 1943. The P-51 Mustang, once an underestimated newcomer, had become the defining Allied fighter of the conflict. Feared by the Luftwaffe and celebrated by the bomber crews it protected. By late 1944, the Mustang was the primary long-range escort of the 8th Air Force. Entire fighter wings flew Mustangs from English bases, spreading across Germany in vast sweeps that left few safe spaces for the Jagdwaffe to reorganize. For American bomber crews, the sudden appearance of the silver-winged fighters above the formation brought visible relief. Many recalled the stark difference between missions before the Mustang and missions after its arrival. Losses dropped, survival increased, confidence returned. Post-war evaluations across multiple air forces offered the same conclusion. The Mustang was not simply fast or long-ranged, it was balanced. Its combination of speed, endurance, maneuverability, visibility, and firepower created a fighter that excelled in nearly every role. This versatility helped the P-51 continue service well beyond World War II, into the early Cold War and even the Korean conflict, where it flew ground attack missions long after jets dominated the skies. For the Luftwaffe veterans who survived the war, the Mustang carried a different meaning. Many German pilots later wrote that the arrival of the P-51 marked the moment the air initiative irreversibly slipped away. Some remembered the dread of seeing Mustangs circling above their airfields even before takeoff. Others recalled desperate dives or fast climbs that once guaranteed escape, maneuvers that the Mustang rendered obsolete. Over time, the legend of the P-51 grew. It became a symbol of Allied industrial coordination, an American airframe perfected by a British engine, and the aircraft most responsible for tearing the Luftwaffe's fighter arm apart from the inside. But its legacy is also quieter, a reminder of how quickly the balance of war can shift when technology, strategy, and timing align. And with that, only one final perspective remains. In the end, the story of the P-51 Mustang is not just about a machine. It is about how belief, confidence, and certainty can crumble in the face of innovation. When the Mustang first appeared, many German pilots dismissed it as another Allied experiment. Too new, too untested, too ordinary. But war has a way of revealing truths quickly. Within months, the laughter faded, replaced by the quiet understanding that the skies had changed. The Mustang's victory was not built on speed alone. It was built on cooperation, an American design refined by a British engine, and on the strategic insight that air superiority required more than defending bombers. It required taking the fight directly to the enemy, anywhere they rose to meet it. For Allied air crews, the Mustang became a guardian. For German pilots, it became a shadow they could never escape. Today, preserved Mustangs sit in museums and airfields, their polished wings reflecting peaceful skies. They stand as reminders of a moment in history when technology and willpower combined to shift the course of a global conflict. And they carry a quiet lesson. In war, as in life, the line between confidence and vulnerability can disappear in the time it takes for a single aircraft to climb through a cold German sky. To counter the heavy bomber streams, the Luftwaffe created specialized Sturmgruppen, groups of heavily armored FW-190s designed to get close enough to shoot down B-17s at point-blank range. They were protected by escorting Bf-109s, forming a layered Gefechtsverband built for one purpose: break the American bomber spine. But the formation was slow, rigid, and vulnerable during climb and assembly. And that is exactly when the P-51 struck. Aggressive Mustang groups tore into the Sturmgruppen before they reached the bombers, breaking the armored FW-190s apart and scattering their Bf-109 escorts. Many Sturm pilots never made it into firing position. Entire German units were shredded in minutes, some losing half their strength in a single engagement. The Luftwaffe's most carefully planned countermeasure was now collapsing under Mustang pressure.